All right. Hello, students. We are in chapter six of market-based management. This is our lecture for chapter six. We're focusing this week on competitive position and sources of advantage. We're going to be focusing on three areas here: understanding competitive advantage, discovering sources of competitive advantage, and then assessing industry attractiveness. So we start this lecture with this fair market value map that we're familiar with from a couple of chapters ago. Remember, if our brand or our product is above this fair price line or fair value line, then we are in a negative or a market share losing position. And then conversely, if our product or service or brand is below this fair market line, then we would say that we are in a market gaining or a positive value position. And so we can see that this fair value map really can serve lots of different purposes. We've looked at, you know, in a couple of chapters ago around the fair market value map and what that can mean. We spoke last about market segmentation. And then this week, we're going to be looking at competitive position and then sources of competitive advantage. Here you can see that we continue to focus on this theme of value rather than cost. And so with that, we want to understand what are the sources of competitive advantage? How does the customer determine customer value? And then from a marketing strategy standpoint, um, how do we determine profitability versus our competitors and by different market segments and subsegments. So this is a bit of review. We can appreciate competitive advantages based upon cost, which we've talked quite a bit about, or we can appreciate competitive advantage based upon differentiation. So for example, the cost advantage example, we can think about, and it's easy to think about in the retail space where there's a reason that some products we will buy at Walmart or Costco as opposed to, um, let's say, Best Buy. Yeah, let's say electronics, right? So if you wanted to buy some type of TV monitor, that's sort of a commoditized sort of product, and therefore I'm probably better off, everything else being equal, buying that from a Walmart, which its competitive advantage ostensibly is we are the low cost leader in the market, as opposed to, let's say, Best Buy, where maybe the same product that is sold at Walmart might likely be more expensive at a Best Buy. However, there might be some, uh, additional services or support or benefits that would be offered through Best Buy that Walmart would be unable to offer because there's not enough profit margin to be able to support that. So within this, market uh, market share gaining section below the fair value line, there are ways that we can position our product. And we had mentioned last lecture about uh, Michael Porter and his seminal book, Competitive Strategy, around we can compete primarily as a as a company from a marketing strategy standpoint around we can have a cost advantage, or we could have a differentiation advantage, or we might argue, I might argue that, that there is sort of this hybrid position of marketing advantage where maybe we offer something differently, but in terms of services and support than the low cost leader, but then we deliver it in a way that it makes it easier for the customer to buy, let's say. And so we think about here in this marketing advantage around our four P's of the marketing mix, maybe, um, for example, the way that the product is purchased is a way that is much more convenient than the same product, but maybe I have to drive somewhere as opposed to like, hey, I can be sitting on my couch and just click a button and it gets shipped directly to me. So, just kind of appreciating these differences. Now, it sort of makes sense, right? That as we move to the right, um, this is sort of another layer underneath this customer value map that we would anticipate, or we would expect that there would be higher and higher levels of customer value which accrue to a product or a service which lies below this fair value line. And then commensurately, we would expect the supplying firm to, there would be higher pre-tax return on investment, a marketing investment associated with moving to the right in creating customer or creating greater customer value as we move to the right. So we can think about laptops. We can think about Dell versus Apple versus Nike. We could appreciate that Dell typically sort of positions itself in the laptop or PC space as being, good value, low cost, as opposed to Apple, more expensive. There's a greater gross margin, but what the Apple uh, solution would provide would be more robust and broader than what you might see in Dell. And then Nike, they don't make laptops as far as I know, but Nike in sports apparel, you can see their percent gross margin is quite a bit different than Dell, um, because for a variety of reasons, I would argue that their brand is so strong that they can command um, extraordinary uh, margins uh, relative to their competitors. But what is interesting as well is we can appreciate the differences here in, if we just look at Dell and Apple, the gross margin for Dell 19.1 versus Apple 42.9, quite a bit of a difference, almost a little more than double. We can see the sales to assets ratio quite a bit higher here with Dell than Apple. So that sort of, I would say, the inverse of this, uh, uh, the cost associated with having to market this product. So we can sort of see this in 4.2 versus 29.8. Um, and then here, this is interesting, right? Our marketing return on investment for Dell, 107%, which is not bad. Um, and then for Apple, quite a bit different, right? Because we've got this additional margin here. And that allows us to, for every dollar that we spend on marketing, we're able to reap In this case, about 5x or a little bit more than 5x of what Dell is able to achieve. And then Nike, of course, different category, but there is, if we say Dell versus Nike, there's almost 2.5x cost, the marketing and sales expense to percentage of sales. And I'm thinking that, for example, if you go to a Nike store, you have more salespeople walking the floor. Maybe they are commissioned and they get a higher commission versus maybe a Dell person where there are fewer brick and mortar stores and there's more online sales, let's say, versus Nike. So, what are some of the sources of competitive advantage? Again, I uh, would refer you to Competitive Strategy by Michael Porter. His basic assertion is that we have cost advantages as a business versus differentiation. And then this notion of marketing advantage, I would argue, maybe is somewhat of a hybrid of these two, and then, sort of vectoring on the 4 Ps of marketing. So, am I a market leader? Do I have some kind of channel monopolistic sort of advantage? Is my product line more broad than my competitor, right? As opposed to, um, the cost advantage is one that we're fairly familiar with. We were talking about, for example, Dell versus Apple. We could think Walmart versus Best Buy, and again, these are 3 different sources of competitive advantage. So, depending upon the level of competitiveness, the if it's a market that the market competitiveness is fairly strident, then the importance of being able to differentiate versus your competitors, either on price or the type of benefits that you're able to offer, or the ways in which your product or service is purchased. You have to determine uh, where you are in each one of those three. You have to essentially stake a claim in one of these three. And Porter talks quite a bit about this idea of being stuck in the middle. And as a business, you never want to be stuck in the middle. You need to firmly anchor yourself around, we're the low cost leader, we are the high touch, higher end kind of benefits leader, or we are the marketing leader because we're able to make our product more readily available, easier to purchase, easier to do business with, kind of idea. So here, this is sort of another layer below this slide here, looking at customer value. It sort of makes sense by logical extension that as further I move along this x-axis where I'm increasing customer value, that I have a greater cost advantage because the level of profitability, pre-tax ROI, is much higher the further to the right than versus further to the left. And so that sort of is a logical extension of this chart here on the right. Now we go back and we sort of reconnect with our microeconomics friends, and remember, when we look at, for example, a cost curve where we have cost on the x-axis and microeconomics, and then, or excuse me, quantity on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis we have price or cost. If you recall, the further we go to the right, the greater the cost advantage is, and I'm lowering my cost cost per unit, right? We can think also about accounting when we look at the variable cost associated with producing a certain number of products or services. The greater the number, the greater the denominator, the lower per unit cost. Okay, and you can see how the math works out there. So at a more of a macro level, what we can see is that we have these cost advantages around scale. So the larger the store, the more units I sell, the lower, or in a theoretical sense, we know from microeconomics that we want to operate at the slope equals zero or the minimum of this cost curve, right? And then, sort of an additional facet associated with this cost effect, the scale effect is for example, here, Honda, they're admittedly one of the global leaders in small engine manufacturing, that the more that they are able to provide offerings that are specific to cars versus motorcycles, lawnmowers, et cetera, the broader your breadth of product line, of course, you are producing and selling more. So you're reaching a lower cost curve, and you know, which is a pretty cool kind of synergistic effect. You're able to tailor your offerings more specifically to each of these various market segments: cars, motorcycles, lawnmowers, snow blowers, pumps. That maybe those are for you know uh, uh, decorative ponds in someone's backyard or in water features, fountains, and so on. We can also appreciate this notion of scale effect and scope effect. We can see that in sales force expense, right? So if I am a salesperson for Procter and Gamble and I'm selling multiple brands, then I am addressing more market segments and my per unit cost associated with the sales force goes down, right? Same kind of scale effect. Same thing around advertising. If I have multiple brands under one manufacturer, so now the cost associated with advertising per unit goes down because the same manufacturer is able to advertise tomato soup, split pea soup, clam chowder, onion soup. So you can see this idea of this long run average cost, or this cost curve, applies to um, manufacturing, to marketing, to sales, to advertising, and so on. The sort of the other side of that coin, of course, is that by offering these various product differentiators, we are moving to the right around customer value. And again, we see that the further the right, the higher the pre-tax return on investment. So we can look at, for example, some of these construction kinds of offerings where the broader the product line, um, the greater the uh, customer value associated with having more and more of those products, but I'm scaling the cost associated with manufacturing and advertising and direct sales. Um, FedEx, right? Similar kind of thing. So maybe I have, 1 week delivery versus 4 hour versus 1 hour versus overnight. So the more that I am able to address these different service needs, I am, as I move to the right, the more I'm able to achieve a higher pre-tax ROI. So, for example, kind of is common sense. If I have a package that needs to go from Kentucky to Southern California to Los Angeles, it's going to cost a lot more if it has to be there overnight versus, it can just be there in a week, right? You can see where this cost dynamic plays itself out in various elements of the overall marketing discipline, if you will. We can think about Rolex or Nikon cameras, or higher end kind of bottled water. Again, you know, uh, to the extent that I've got this, a stronger brand, I probably have customers that are less less price sensitive. I was trying to create a new word, or lice. That's not a new word. It's just not applicable here. They're less price sensitive, and therefore I'm able to command a higher price if I have a stronger brand. I'm able to command if I, what is this? Is that Coach? I should know what that logo is, but certainly we know Rolex or Nikon or Perrier. So if I have a, a greater stature of brand imagery, then customers follows would be less price sensitive. And then again, this is just another facet of this cost advantage um, dynamic where the greater my market share, I'm able to spread various costs associated with maintaining that market share around advertising, production, support, and so on. So you can see that being a market leader, there are many advantages that accrue to a market leader, and and they really sort of build up this sort of metaphorical force field around them that creates even more um, competitive advantage. The imagery that's coming to mind is if you've ever seen a topographical map. And so let's say map of the United States, we could look at all of the states in the union. But then if we add um, topography, then we would sort of have this tactile sense if it were a physical topographical map, where if I am on the top of Pikes Peak in Colorado, if I run my finger over that, right, it is coming, the peak, Pikes Peak is way above the base of that map, and it says that not only is there a competitive advantage if I have this metaphorical summit position, if I'm, let's say, Google or Hewlett Packard in printing or Apple in laptops, that not only do I have a distance in terms of two-dimensionally, I'm further away from, let's say, Colorado is far away from Massachusetts uh, in terms of not only longitude and latitude, but also in terms of height or altitude. And so, again, there's sort of this synergistic effect. So, as I'm a market leader, I continue to build this sort of these walls, defensive walls, or force field, driven by having these inherent cost advantages that I'm able to spread out um, my cost per unit, whether it be production or advertising or sales. We can have a product line advantage. So, um, I know we're at Asbury, so we're not supposed to really talk about beer. But in a hypothetical sense, if you are a beer manufacturer and you have all these different, um, you know, product lines then that allows you to tailor your offerings to different market segments, and therefore you're able to enhance your return on assets. Now, another thing here that is important to appreciate, again, we've got sort of this 45-degree angle with distributor outlet share on the x-axis, and then market share um, on the y-axis. And so, what this curve, particularly this curve above this 45-degree angle, is indicating that if I have greater market share and I'm able to control as you can see here, the access that customers have to your product, then there is that multiplicative effect where not only am I reaping all the cost benefits associated with being a market share leader, but I'm also, because of that restricted access, again, if we think about microeconomics, if the supply curve moves to up and to the left, then that equilibrium price goes up. So, in a sense, if there is restricted access to a market leader's product or service, then there is more price advantages, and there are greater um, profit margin opportunities because because I'm the market leader and I maintain a significant market share advantage. I also am able to control to a greater extent the access that you can get to my product. Now, again, by sort of logical extension, if we take all of these cost and profit competitive advantages and we sort of overlay them into competitor knowledge on the x-axis and customer knowledge on the y-axis, um, you can see that again, we can, if we have a really good understanding of our competitors and a really good understanding of what our customers need, want, and desire. So I have this sort of knowledge advantage because I have, we used to call it again when I was in the corporate space, sounds maybe a little bit weird. We would talk about customer intimacy. So, this idea that I have a sort of an insider's level understanding of what my customers' needs, wants, and desires are. And by extension, I also have a better understanding of how my competitors match to my own advantages within this unique um, customer intimacy space. So, again, we can take this notion of cost advantages and two by two matrices, and we can continue to extend that thought across both cost and profitability uh, layers. So, one thing we can do, and here Best introduces this notion of multidimensional scaling. This can give us an idea of brand strength. So, basically, what we're saying here, if we look on the right, this map on the left is sort of derived from from this math table on the right. So it says that Honda, in the minds of uh, customers, that they view Honda to be quite different than Lincoln or Mercedes. And so if we look here, Volvo to Honda, looks like that's um, uh, fairly similar, right? That if we look at this sort of what we call Euclidean distance, but if we look at Honda versus Lincoln, let's see, where is my, whoops, Lincoln, Lincoln Honda. Yeah, there's a 10, right? So this math says that basically says the customer sort of like, yeah, Lincoln and Honda, they are really different. And you can see that in this degrees of differentiation. And then when you plot it, you can see that there is a significant difference in brand perception between Lincoln and Honda. So now we sort of establish we need to understand what is our brand or our company product or service competitive advantage. We have to stake a claim in one of those areas of competitive advantage. And so we need to discover not only internally looking at what we think are as a company or as a brand our um, advantages are relative to our competitors, but we also need to ask our customers how they perceive us, right? So if I were Honda and I just did an internal assessment and I were because I have a pretty myopic, I don't have a clear objective view, I might say internally, yeah, Honda and Lincoln, boy, we're actually pretty close. And I don't know how you would necessarily determine that internally, but it just suffices it to say if you're doing an internal assessment of your performance versus competition, you by definition do not have an objective perspective. And so if I only ask myself internally, how different are MI Honda versus Lincoln, I'm probably not going to see that this dramatic difference. And so when I'm looking for sources of competitive advantage, I have to not only look internally, but I also have to look externally to my customers and my competitors to be able to have sort of that objective perspective. So here's a little bit of, cloak and dagger, James Bond kind of stuff. So, as a in a corporation, be it large or small, you're always sort of monitoring your competition. So, but obviously, your competitor is not going to tell you, hey, we're not doing great, right? I mean, you by definition are not going to share that information. But if there is information that is publicly available, I'm going to take advantage of that. So, for example, if I see my competitors laying off employees, well, that looks like maybe they're not doing great, right? Um, maybe are they not replacing people as they retire? Maybe are they cutting investment in R&D? These are symptoms of an underlying cause, which is, hey, my competitor's got some problems, right? Now that's around pressure around uh, improving profits and cash flow, and you will see that often in publicly traded companies where every quarter they have to make public their financial performance. On the other hand, here are behaviors that if you see a competitor that they're exhibiting these behaviors that they would lack market leadership or focus. So maybe they're changing their advertising message, changing ad agencies. I mean, there's an old saying that if you're an ad agency, when you take on a new client, you know you're going to get fired by that client. You just don't know when. Another example of a competitor having a lack of market leadership, lower than average sales per salesperson. They have a vague value proposition. They're cutting prices. So, I if I have less market leadership, what can I do? There's only so much I probably can do. So the one that happens most often in a competitive selling situation is I'll just cut my price, um, which sounds great in the short run, but in the long run ends up, in many cases, becoming sort of a signal of a dying company or a dying brand. Here we're looking at different airlines, right? So we've got American Airlines, Delta. I'm not sure which one this was, and then United. Um, Again, this is a little bit dated, so I'm sure there's a big carrier I'm not thinking of that they would be in this category, but um, what we can do, and we've seen this throughout Best's um, slides and textbook, is that we can examine competitive brands within a given industry and look at, sort of diagnosing through the lens of market share, customer sat, gross margin, marketing return on sales, and so on. And we can sort of get an idea of, who's doing well and who's not doing well. So if I were, at this particular point in time, um, there might be a reason why I don't know who the CO company is because I see some negatives here, right? Delta historically has done fairly well financially. The airlines, to the best of my knowledge, it's a tough business. It is a really tough business. So we've seen over the years lots of consolidation. United here, we've got negatives that are more profound than CO. It'll come to me after this lecture. But so when you see these kinds of negative numbers here, if you're United, you have to find a way to increase profitability. That can be through buying competitive products or reducing employees. Obviously, lots of different ways, but certainly you cannot persist with a negative return on sales, negative return on assets for the long term. You just can't survive. So again, we go to our friend here, our two by two matrix, and here we're looking at marketing return on sales or return on investment on the x-axis, and then operating income on the y-axis. And so what we see here is that there's a lot of variability here. The average airline seems to be below the line around marketing return on sales versus operating income. Um, and then operating income versus marketing return on investment. What's interesting is that return on sales versus return on investment, right? You sort of think about where does return on sales versus return on investment, where does that reside on the income statement? And it's not too surprising that you're going to see this average airline plot move to the left. Okay. Now, what's interesting here is it does appear the average airline is underwater around relative to this 45-degree angle around marketing return on share versus operating income. But looking at marketing return on investment versus operating income, it's above the line. So, um, I don't know who these airlines are here, but I would be feeling really good. If I were this airline up here, I'm feeling really good. Anywhere up here above the line, especially if I'm above the line in return on sales and return on investment, that's a really good thing, right? So the headline, the average five airlines well below averages in median performance on operating income, marketing return on sales, and return on investment for the 200 Fortune 500 companies, right? So we were saying before, um, airlines, it's a tough business. You can see in both cases, they're pretty close to the line. If you're in a company or in an industry, if you're one of these Fortune 500 companies that resides well above the line, then I'm feeling pretty good, right? So airlines, again, tough businesses, tough. How do I know it's a tough business? Because I'm pretty close to the line. I'm below the line here, and I'm barely above the line over here. We can look at, again, if we're analyzing our own internal performance, if we say let's say in my 20-year case, if I was looking at Lexmark printing manufacturer versus HP or Xerox, I might say, well, my market share as Lexmark was 6%, HP 17%. Whoops, uh-oh, I'm behind. Now, maybe I've got, Lexmark's case, we prided ourselves on having very nichey industry solutions. And in theory, we should have been able to command an extraordinary uh, higher than market pricing. And so that this relative price, you would say, well, I'm below on market share, but I've differentiated myself in a way that I'm able to command higher relative price versus my competitors. So you can kind of go down the line here and you can examine sort of from a, um, sort of from an income statement perspective where I can look at each one of these metrics and see where am I ahead or where am I behind. And so I often use for my students uh, this notion that when we go to the doctor and when he or she runs some tests on us, whether it's blood chemistry or range of motion or whatever it may be, all of those numbers on that test result sheet give you an indication of where you are doing better or doing worse, right? And so these kinds of tools, um, as a marketing executive, you want to be able to use these metrics to diagnose where you can improve, right? This is often a, 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 a this notion of competitive benchmarking here. Uh, I know a lot about the document handling world, spending 20 years there. So, for example, you might if you're HP and you're comparing, your services offerings versus Xerox, maybe Xerox had lots of billing errors, and so they said, well, who does a good job of handling billing errors? Well, looks like American Express does a good job, and so you could learn from a company that is excelling in that particular performance area, but is outside of your industry, right? So Xerox is not in the same industry as American Express. And so you could see that I would maybe feel comfortable if I'm a Xerox executive going to my counterpart, American Express, and saying, hey, we're struggling a bit on billing. We're not really obvious competitors. Would you be willing to share some of your business processes to be able to help us improve our performance within our own industry? Now, if we look sort of at the industry level, then we're again trying to understand what is our competitive position, what is our individual company or individual brands competitive position, and so we can look. Many of you that have had me before uh, as a marketing professor is this idea of SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And so we start to look at these, what we call exogenous factors around, um, supplier selling power, product substitutes. So these are at the industry level aspects of the industry that I can't at an individual firm level necessarily control. I might be able to influence somewhat, but I need to take these elements into account so that I can sort of position myself relative to the industry forces and then relative to my competitors in the industry. When I see these snake diagrams, particularly in this, industry analysis. I've never done sailing, so sailboat out on a lake. You sort of see them. I mean, it looks pretty cool, but I've never been on a sailboat. But the wind is generally only moving one direction, yet you see sailboats moving in different directions, right? Well, how does that work? Well, you depending on the angle of the sail in the sailboat, you're moving to the left or moving to the right. You're able to pivot depending upon the angle that you're moving the sail in your sailboat relative to the wind, right? And so that is one way for us to sort of metaphorically think about how do we, as an industry participant, operate. And so I got to understand these exogenous factors and sort of tack to the left or to the right based upon where I am in my competitive landscape and what are the industry level forces that are influencing intra industry participants or intra industry companies. Again, if we think about, and I love these 2x2 matrices, obviously Best does as well. We can sort of think about the biological extension. Um, all of these different aspects that we've looked at around competitive position have implications around, let's say, pricing strategies. So if we think about tacking, around is it more competitive? Is it more intense versus less intense? Then I've got to determine, am I going to lower my price? Am I going to hold my price? And all of these different elements are going to make a determining, have a determining effect on my ultimate price decision. Again, this is where having a mathematical background in marketing really helps. We could use various analytical tools to determine, based upon all these different market industry forces and competitive position versus my own company, what should be my strategy based upon all of those different factors. Well, that is it for chapter 6. Thank you, students, for your attention. God bless you, and I will see you next time.